Okay, our next session will be discussion with Rick West, entitled The Nature of Native Arts, Reflections on the Work of Richard West Sr., and this will be moderated by John Lukavic, who I've introduced earlier. Rick West was the president and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West and is director emeritus and founding director of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. Here at the Autry, he is the ambassador to Native communities. He is a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma and a member of the Southern Cheyenne Society of Peace Chiefs. Because of his vast knowledge and experience, West served several roles at several institutions, including being a board member at the International Coalition of Sight and Consciousness, the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, the Denver Art Museum, and many others. He previously served on the boards of the Ford Foundation, Stanford University, and the Kaiser Family Foundation. He also was chair of the board of directors at the American Alliance of Museums and the vice president of the International Council of Museums. Is there anything you haven't done yet, Rick? It is challenging to express the profound impact Rick West has had on museums worldwide in a biography. Instead, next year's Marshall McKay seminar will be dedicated to Rick West and the archive which he has donated to the Autry and his profound impact on the field of museum studies. So that's next year's Marshall McKay seminar. Please welcome Rick West, and this discussion will be moderated by John.
Well, hello, Rick.
Hi.
We
Good
just saw each
afternoon.
other in Denver a couple days ago, so.
And I just came from Montana, Brocade. I think we may have brought the rain, actually, because it was sort of going on up there, too.
So for those of you who were here earlier this morning, when I gave my whirlwind overview of all of Plains art history in 20 minutes, there was a moment in the middle there when I talked about kind of the mid-20th century, specifically the work of your father, as well as Oscar Howe, and kind of that moment in time where there was a transition that was happening from kind of that flat 2D style, the studio style, to adding more depth and dimension to the work, but also in what some people might call abstraction, while at the same time still maintaining cultural connection and knowledge in that. That was the background. I don't want to jump directly into that. Maybe we should probably start for the benefit of the audience. Can you talk a little bit about, who your father was, his role, and kind of the environment in which he was working?
Yes, I will. Dad actually kind of grew up in the, he grew up in the way that Native men did in the first half of the 20th century, and that he was in boarding schools until he was in his 20s. But one thing that happened was when he was at Haskell, being trained to be a bricklayer and a carpenter, somebody noticed that he had a talent for art. And so he went from there to Bacone College, and in Oklahoma became part of what eventually is referred to as the Native Fine Arts movement in Oklahoma, which had considerable impact on Plains painting, I think, during the second half of the 20th century. And from that came, through the University of Oklahoma, the Kiowa Six, and then Dad came in that train of artists who were actually given studio training during that period. And of course, he began in life as a Plains painter, flat two-dimensional work, but went lots of other places. And I think that there are two lessons that I take from it. We can talk more about it when we see things up on the screen. But there were two things going on. For one thing, there was innovation stylistically in the art. that's one aspect of it, which we'll be able to see from some of the examples that will come up on the screen. But what I want to emphasize is a point which was made explicitly and implicitly by all of the previous speakers, and I wish I could have heard them all, but I caught the last two speakers as I was coming in. And that is this undeniable connection between Native arts, whatever the medium is. It can be visual art, painting, sculpture, it can be beadwork, but there is this undeniable connection between art and art production and artist's work and culture. Europeans did it differently. They did it the same way until they got to the Renaissance. And then art ended up on museum walls rather than in homes. There's a respect in which artistic production in Native communities, even now, is very much linked and tied up with cultural maintenance and sustaining culture. And I recognize that in what my dad was doing at the time, which we will see, I think, in some of the examples going forward. But I think that that's an important distinction, I think, between how I believe Native artists function and how artists from other societies may have looked at art production.
So let's take a look at this style here. I showed a slide earlier of a work by your father in the Denver Art Museum's collection that shows a group of men sitting around in a landscape, but they were positioned where their societies would sit. There was very much it was a teaching moment. I mean, it was a teaching painting. And I know your father also illustrated a book called, Wolves of Heaven, that's about the animal dance ceremony or the Mosmum ceremony.
Correct.
So there very much clearly was a point in his career where kind of maintaining that cultural knowledge was a central part of his work.
I don't think there's any question about that. And you just look at the time period, really. And Dad, as I briefly explained, was really a product of what happened to lots of Native students in the first half of the 20th century, is that they all ended up in boarding schools, with the objective of the boarding schools fundamentally being to strip them of every ounce of Native culture that they had in their beings. And so he kind of came to his career as an artist with that in mind. And I think as I look at Dad's work during the 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, it was very much focused on an effort to preserve and remember culture that may look in retrospection, but it was intended as a way of benefiting the future, of keeping hold of certain kinds of things going into the future. I mean, this particular painting is of a dogman soldier, which was common to lots of Native Plains societies, Native societies, including the Cheyenne and the Arapahos. And it is, flat two-dimensional work. Dad was a very good figurative painter, and he had a love of detail. And I was kind of thinking of that when I was thinking of what Brocade was saying. And just as a brief diversion, I want to say that when I was listening to Brocade, I was thinking, I promised Brocade I have never made a harsh remark about Crow Pink. I promise you that. And indeed, I have thought that if I ever came back as a horse instead of a human being, I would want to be sure that I ended up in the Crow community because of what they do with their horses that even we Cheyennes don't match. But this was an effort, I think, to invoke memory of the dogman soldier. The dogman soldier among Cheyenne societies was among the most important because they were our rear guard. They were the last people who attempted to defend the community if it was under fire. And so that's the story that sits behind this particular painting. But in almost all of his art, and we will look at it, what I associate with it is not the art per se, but the story that sits behind it and the story that is being told at the same time the piece of art is being created.
So in the 1940s, the University of Oklahoma brought in 3 students in particular, your father, Oscar Howe, and Chief Cherry Saul.
All right.
And there was, maybe before I get to that, is there anything more that you want to talk about in terms of the development of these kinds of narrative styles before we get into some of the more...
No, you can.
okay,
You
all
can
right.
go ahead.
So this
Yeah.
is another example, I guess you could say. But in the 1940s...
Oh, what I would say.
Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah, if you go back to that one, what's interesting in the previous one, if you can pull it back up, is that the Native Fine Arts movement in Oklahoma put artists who were alive at the time in various places, and this is what is referred to as kind of a transition point, if you will. In other words, it is not pure, flat, two-dimensional figurative art, but it is art that begins to have dimensionality and perspective in it, and it has movement in it. And that was one of the things which Dad is Native art history is beginning to develop as a place of scholarship and attention is always interesting to me, and that is often where Dad ends up in the description of art history, even though, as you and I will go in a minute, to paintings which indicate he also went elsewhere.
Sure, and also, like, these artists were not working in a vacuum. I mean, there was also, happening in New Mexico, there was like the San Ildefonso self-taught group. There was then the Santa Fe Indian School group.
Correct.
Then, of course, Oscar Howe was actually part of that in the 1930s as well, before kind of, coming together. And, you had told me the other day that your father was in somewhat recruited, and identified as someone, who has this potential to help push things even further. And I'll go to the next slide.
Oh, I think that's right. Yeah, it's when Dad began to, in style, paint more abstract work. And honestly, it is that work of his that is, all the photos that you're seeing are paintings that are actually in our own personal collection at home. And it is when Dad was doing this kind of exploration. And as a matter of fact, before this painting was actually done, he was the first Native person who was ever awarded a Master of Fine Arts degree by the University of Oklahoma. And that was at a time when he was already beginning this kind of further exploration and varying in style. And so it is important to note that Native people have never been locked up in a particular place. I remember when I was the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, one time being involved in a discussion with a DC Fine Arts Council in Washington, D.C. that had to sign off on all of our architectural drawings.
I used to work for them, by the way.
I know that. I know that. And so this will not come as a great shock to you. But I was sitting there across from a gentleman named J. Carter Brown IV, who was the famous director of the National Gallery of Art. And Carter Brown was talking to us about the design of our building. And he said, now, Rick, he was making a joke. I didn't consider it to be a particularly flattering joke, but he was making a joke about how, please, Rick, just imagine for me, if you will, when you're thinking about what goes up on the mall, that it's something that goes beyond teepees and in form. And I said, well, you'll be comforted to know that Native artists were among those who, long before Europe ever got to the point, were capable of artwork that speaks in abstraction and is indeed non-representational work. But so Dad wanted to explore that territory too, and indeed his master's thesis at the University of Oklahoma, which included 6 paintings, all of which were abstract in nature, was an attempt to explore different styles. Now, I can look at this painting, and I know kind of the story that sits behind it. It's called Spatial Relationships, and it's actually a take on Cheyenne cosmology. And if you look at the symbology, which is in the painting, everything from the sun to the moon to the swoops of water and references that are really to Cheyenne cosmology, it also tells a story every bit as important and as explicit as anything I said in talking about the Dogman Soldier.
That's another key aspect that we talked about earlier, specifically the work by women artists, and Cheyenne women artists, of course,
Yes.
that encoded cultural knowledge and philosophies and value systems within the works, and that was not only communicated through these works that may seem abstract to an outsider, to someone who doesn't have that knowledge, but as an insider, who someone does have the knowledge, it is as understandable as anything else.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at Cheyenne's, for example, the men, the women, if you look at buffalo hides done by women, they are always abstract. And I was thinking of what Brocade was saying about what can be embodied in an abstract design and how certain designs become her own and are important to her family, what she wants to communicate to her own children going forward as valuable cultural knowledge. That is all done that way. The men who actually did buffalo hides were often they were the historians, they were the history keepers, and they were figurative, and they were representational, and they were not abstract. But it was the women who did some of the most beautiful work I've ever seen in doing painted buffalo hides. And there was all kinds of cultural knowledge that was locked up in the abstraction. So again, there was a story that sat behind whatever piece of art you happen to be looking at.
Yeah, Oscar Howe he called himself a modern day skin painter. Right. So even in his work that was seemingly as abstract as
Right.
Things along this line, he saw it as recording cultural knowledge,
Yes.
and that he was in that legacy. He was in that line of centuries and centuries of indigenous artists who were maintaining their culture in an artistic form.
That's right, and it causes me to think of this kind of going forward. I think of a couple of different stories that are pertinent to what you just said. One story is about Alan Hauser when he was a student at the Santa Fe Indian School. And one of the famous sort of keepers, non-native keepers of native knowledge there, who I should probably leave unnamed, basically looked down at what Alan Hauser was doing on a piece of paper and drawing, and made the comment, I don't think you'll ever really be an artist because you can't follow the rules. And these were rules that she was imposing on what he was doing. Fortunately, he actually ignored her completely and went on to have his own very brilliant career in art. And what I want contemporary native artists always to keep that in mind. Where it leads, I think, is that there is actually, even in the museum world, which is my piece of museums, having been a museum director, an acceptance of native artists as being people worthy of putting in collections in museums. What I want to be sure of is that, and so sometimes the popular response to that is, well, how wonderful. We now accept you as being part of us in museums. What I want to be sure of is that museums recognize that Native artists wish to join us on their own terms. And I want Native artists always to be in control of what they're doing with their art. They're not doing it because they are mimicking something that has come to them from elsewhere. It is their own expression we're talking about. And I want them to come into art on their own terms, and I think they are. I look at contemporary Native artists now, and I think that they have turned the usual world on its head, actually, and that they indeed are insistent upon making statements in their own voice and on their own terms, and museums have best learned to accept that and embrace that, because it is important to the work that museums do too.
Yeah, in the broader art world, from around the world, indigenous arts are like, they're the hot thing right now.
Yes.
They're but what, and there seems to be almost like this sense of surprise, like, oh, how did we not know this? And it's
Right.
because the outside world did not have their eyes open, because there have been for generations and generations and generations incredible work being created, and it's no surprise to probably anyone in this room that the broader art world is finally waking up to it.
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of ironic. I remember a good friend of mine who sits on one of the boards that I sit on, is a very distinguished non-native lawyer in New York City, and he called me up one day sort of breathless because he'd seen one of Jean Quick-to-See Smith's works at the Whitney in New York, and he said, "Why?" He said, "Rick, why haven't you told me? Why haven't I known about her?" And I said, "Marty, she's been painting for a half century. You just haven't been looking, quite frankly." And I think that is true, but that is also what I mean. If any of you know John Quick-to-See Smith, she was insistent that you accept her on her terms as an artist, and recognize her voice in it, and that her voice might not come to you the same way that those artists which came via the Enlightenment and Western Europe might be coming to you.
Do we have any other slides here? I forgot to. Oh, there's another one. But
Yes. Yeah, this one is called Festival of Life, and it's one of Dad's of my favorites of Dad's. He did it in, I think, probably the early '60s, and there is a famous juried exhibition in New York, a biennial. I mean, in Washington D.C., a biennial which has been done, and this sort of reflects another battle that Native artists had, and that was that anything that a Native visual artist did was somehow stuck into the corner as ethnographic art. In other words, sort of an adjunct of anthropology or something, rather than in an art museum. And Dad was juried into this show. Would have been the early '60s, I think, and was one of the first times. It was the first time that particular biannual exhibition had ever had a Native artist in it. But again, if you look at it, there are all kinds of stories embedded in it, and they're sort of cross-tribal. I mean, it's not just Cheyennes that we see in that, but I see lots of other things. But it is celebrating something which does pull lots of different tribes together in how we see life, and that life is, and you see the circles in it. For us, life is a constant circle. Beginnings that don't end on a straight line, that don't end up on a straight line at an end point. An end point is a new beginning and new life. And this was simply an effort to document, that concept, which is inherent, I think, in any number of Native cultures and different tribes, frankly.
Great.
Yeah.
I believe we are, do we have a moment or two for any questions, or do you want to call it a day? Two questions or 2 minutes?
Let's do a couple questions.
Okay. You know, there's a mic in the back there. There's a bright light in her eyes, so I can't
Yeah,
see
I
anything.
can't see
so.
anything.
Bring down the light as well a little bit.
There is a question up front here.
Rick, you have this incredible family history in the art world and in the native cultural world. Your knowledge is encyclopedic on the native art world, and yet, as a professional, you're a lawyer.
Correct.
What happened?
Well, my parents wondered that for a while. It's interesting. Both my parents are artists. My dad was a visual artist. My mom, who was non-native actually, was a musician. And my brother initially was a banker, and I was a lawyer. But I don't know. You know, I can't explain everything. I made the switch. I was a practicing native rights lawyer for the first half of my career. And in my 40s, I just decided to make a switch. And the switch was, it made more sense than a lot of people thought it did. In this way, as a lawyer, what my objective had been was to protect the legal and constitutional rights and prerogatives of tribes, of native nations. When I became the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, it was a switch, but a related switch, because I saw that as an effort to make sure that we could confirm the cultural representational rights of tribes and keep our grip on culture. Again, this notion that legal prerogatives for the Native community are not worth too much in the end unless there is also cultural sovereignty. And so those are the bindings of my own career. And it's interesting, my parents never, despite the fact that they were musicians and my brother became a banker and I became a lawyer, they let us go our own way. And in the same way, now we've done that for our kids. You know, we have a filmmaker for a son who, I guess the art genes still live. Part of it, I guess, David, is that culture has simply, and the maintenance of it and the sustaining of it has always been central to my life. That was true with my dad, and it's that legacy, I think, that drives everything that I have done, both as a lawyer and then subsequently as a museum director.
So I want to first point out, though, that if I understand the career trajectory, and this is crucial, you first set out to be a historian.
That's true. I went to grad.
So
yes,
let's
I know.
remember that.
I did go to grad school, but I'll tell you what happened, and then you can finish your question. So I graduated from college. I went off to Harvard to study American history, and I discovered, and I shall leave them unnamed, they were a very distinguished history faculty, and you would recognize all of them, that they knew nothing about Native communities and Native history, and so I decided I would go elsewhere.
Okay.
That's what happened.
What I was going to say, though, is, and this I think is a good way to wrap and to look ahead, is I believe many of the answers that you're seeking, David, about the trajectory of Rick West's career and how he ended up going first to be a historian, then a lawyer, then a museum director, first at MAI and then at the Autry, are actually in the various dozens of boxes that are sitting right over here being processed. And so I think what I would just sort of say, and maybe you'll tease, everyone should mark November 14th, 2026 on their calendars, because that will be the next Marshall McKay seminar for empowering native knowledge. And as I say, the answer to all these questions are in those boxes.
Well, let me put an addendum to that. If I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But what I learned just having gotten here late, and I originally I was to be here the entire day, but what makes me happiest is, honestly, I'm delighted that anything I may have contributed to this path may be sitting over there, but I'm grateful for the voices of those artists whose voices I heard prior to my being up here, because that's the future.
Rick, I have one last question for you, and I want to take it to your brother, who you mentioned went off and became a banker. We know that your brother went on to something else after being a
Yes, he did.
banker too. And to me, it was a wonderful thing with which he was involved, and that was the Futures for Children program.
Yes.
But maybe you would comment on how he found his way to that from being a banker.
Well, one thing I've learned, he's my younger brother, but one thing I've still learned is never to speak for him. But so he may give you an entirely different answer. But both of us, I think, have tried in whatever we did, whether it was law, banking, museums, or Futures for Children, to speak to a Native future. Because through our dad, I guess, we knew how imperiled it had been and how difficult it had been. And so whatever path we chose, any of those four things that you just referred to that he and I have done, it has been tied in some way to trying to secure a cultural future for the first citizens of the Americas, if you will.
Well, with that, I will note that this was recorded, and at some point in the very near future, the entire day will be available on presumably YouTube or the website for the Autry Museum. So, Rick, you can have some fun going to bed viewing of everything you missed earlier in the day. We'll give you the test later on.
Thank you.
So, Joe, do you have any final words? Or all right, well, welcome Joe back.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
all.
Woo-wee! What a great day. What a great day. Thank you to all the presenters who came such a long way. Thank you for all of you who came out in the rain. It's much appreciated. Thank you to the staff, our IT folks, the food. Everybody was great. So grateful for this day. Keep in mind that the opening for Creative Continuities is from 5 to 7 this evening. I've had a few people approach me and say, dang it, Joe, I forgot to sign up. Can I still go? The answer is no. No, I'm just kidding. The answer is yes. Of course you can come. Please, when you go to check in, just tell them you were at the McKay seminar. Be happy to let you in. It's going to be a nice evening. So again, thank you, everybody, and please drive safely.